Welcome to the Writer's Den. My name is Jane Waters Thomas, and today we have poet and educator John Davis Jr. with us, and we're going to talk a little bit about his book, The Middle-Class American Proverb. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, John, as an educator, forming young minds, working with, and I'm going to call them what they are, brilliant young writers, tell me a little bit about what that process looks like. I know you're at Harrison School for the Arts here in Polk County, and you have the best of the best in your classrooms.
That is so true. We have an open auditions process, and oftentimes it's difficult because we have so many wonderful writers here in Polk County who want to be part of the program. Honestly, there are many more than we would be able to take, and so in essence what we have within the Harrison Creative Writing Program is indeed the best of the best. So many times we have students who audition who either have a very adamant interest in fiction or nonfiction or poetry, and all of that interest kind of manifests itself in their talent and their gift. And so to facilitate that and to kind of help bring the next generation of writers forward is really pretty much an honor. Especially when you're looking at the kind of students that we have who are geared toward the humanities and who are geared toward maybe a future career in English or in creative writing itself. It's been very rewarding so far.
Absolutely, and you know, with your history, having been in the newsroom, having been published, and now working with these children, and I'm going to say our young adults at this point, that are going to be going into some of the fields that you yourself have been a part of. You're really teaching them to master their craft in many of the ways that you yourself master your craft. When a child sits down in front of you, or your group of students are sitting before you, tell me a little bit about sort of the process that you share with them as they're beginning to master the craft of poetry or creative writing.
Many of our students come with a solid sense of what writing should look like, feel like, and their own voice that is still developing. What I attempt to do within my classroom is take that developing voice and then allow it to be refined in various ways. In one case, we'll start with some different genres. Fiction. Students who are naturally geared toward fiction oftentimes have read things like Harry Potter or The Hunger Games or mostly young adult selections. And so you can tell from the flavor of their writing that that's where they have geared or tooled their own diction. I try to expose them to a number of different influences from the canon as well as from contemporary literature so that they can broaden that perspective. As far as nonfiction goes, we don't see with our younger writers the adamant interest in nonfiction that we do in fiction and then of course in poetry. But for those who are doing creative nonfiction, it's very important that they have a process that they can go back to. Excuse me. And oftentimes we find that they haven't quite nailed down that process yet. And so by providing them with a process, they're more able to think about what it is they're doing and how it is they're doing it. There's a metacognition that's involved there. With students who are poets, it's a different game altogether because we have forms that we start with. We introduce them, if they don't already know, to the villanelle, to the sonnet, to the sestina, to all of the different forms that are out there. Because when student writers take their ideas and they are frankly forced to put them into a form, it's a starting point for them, because then later on they can say, well look, you know, that first villanelle I wrote really didn't work out because I was trying to force rhymes, or that first sonnet that I wrote, it didn't sound natural because I was trying to do something within a set of confines. But later on, when they have an idea of their own and they think, well, you know, this is really something that would fit well into a sestina or into a villanelle or a sonnet or what have you, then they are able to use those tools and put them at their disposal so that then they can deploy them in the best way possible. A lot of times, by guiding students through a writing process and having them think about their writing process, whether they're in nonfiction, fiction, or poetry, they are then able to go back and say, well, maybe I did so-and-so, we'll say pre-writing. Maybe I did too much pre-writing before. Maybe I did too much editing before. Maybe I edited the life out of something. And by getting them to think, by getting them to be metacognitive writers, one of the things that is accomplished is then they can kind of monitor their own progress, and they can say, yeah, I remember we talked about this in class, but then also from personal experience, they're able to say, yeah, I'm editing the life out of this, or I'm pre-writing it too much, or I've done too many drafts, or whatever the case happens to be for their particular situation.
You know, when adults get into a writer's block, it looks a lot different than when a student gets into a writer's block. Do you agree?
Absolutely.
You know, when we're dealing with students that are writing and they are so passionate, they're just so passionate about what they're doing, the words that are flowing from their fingertips. You know, one of the things that I often think about with some of my own students is not stopping the flow at all until they are done with that. Just keeping that flow going. How do you get your students from the end of that flow to the end of that story back to that form?
One of the things that we have found to be true with student writers is that when they are in that creative flow state that you were referring to, it is almost impossible to distract them from that task. We're blessed in that we have students who necessarily want to be writers, and so it is their fixation. It is the thing that they focus on. But when they are in that state of creative flow, once they get to the end of it, to answer your question, getting them to take those ideas and to think about what form they might fit best in is one of the questions we ask probably about halfway through. I don't like stopping my students' creative flow, but a lot of times it's somewhere around that midpoint that they need guidance to say, well, this topic that you're writing about, as an example, we'll say they're writing about their grandmother's house. This particular piece of writing that you're doing about your grandmother's house might make a better piece of creative nonfiction instead of being the basis for the fiction that the student was writing to begin with. So there is some ongoing monitoring, there's progress monitoring that occurs with student writers, even when they're in that state of creative flow, so that then when they get to the end, we don't have a situation where they've written, say, a 10-page short story that should have been maybe an article for another publication altogether.
Now that doesn't sound a whole lot different than how we teach adults to do that same process. You're dealing with really advanced writers at Harrison. These kids don't just get in there on a whim. They're serious. You're able to select the students, almost handpick the students that come into your program, which is definitely a blessing, kind of cool to be able to do that. That gives you a different quality of classroom experience, not only for you as an instructor, I would think, but also as a student in that environment.
Yes, because they are surrounded by peers who are equally interested in creative writing. That does a lot for our program, because there's not a situation necessarily where one student is very gung-ho for writing and then you have someone right next to them who would rather be sitting, say, in statistics.
Right.
Not that I'm against statistics, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yes.
But yeah, all of those students who are together, because they're in that same environment, they have a shared passion, and it's contagious. You know, one person might be an extraordinary poet and another person is an extraordinary fiction writer, and when those two come together, a lot of times there is this sharing of passion that feeds off of the different passions within one group. Yeah.
Now, does the creative writing class, does that class assist in newsletters, student publications, anything of that nature? Are there opportunities for that?
We do have one student publication right now. It is not necessarily the yearbook. It is not journalism per se. It is literary journalism in the form of our literary magazine, which is entitled Lingo. In fact, one of the first things we'll be doing in this school year is we'll be selling copies of Lingo. It's really been a wonderful effort. I had students last year who were phenomenal editors as well as phenomenal writers, and so what we have as a result of that is a literary magazine full of young writers' imaginings that is probably on the same par with an awful lot of collegiate literary magazines.
That's exciting. That's exciting to know that that comes right out of the public school system.
Yes,
and that we have that quality of students that are able to produce that kind of material, which leads me really to my next line of thoughts with regard to you, and that's you as a poet and as once a writer, always a writer. I should say once a writer, always a writer. But you know, in your book, Middle Class American Proverb, there's some really interesting titles in there. There's some really interesting collections in there. Let's talk a little bit about that publication and how you crafted that, and what that was like for you as you began that process.
Absolutely. I was in the Master of Fine Arts program at University of Tampa. It's a low residency program, which means I went for 10 days each semester to be there on campus, and I was absolutely inspired by the mentors I had in that program, poets like Peter Meinke and Erica Dawson, and some other very well-known names who would be recognizable within the literary community. One of the things that did for me is it allowed me to focus not necessarily solely on my craft, but it allowed me to devote more time to my craft. And as a result of that, the book you have there actually was the manuscript of my creative thesis from the MFA program. I was fortunate in that I had made a friend in the form of Sue Walker, Dr. Sue Walker, who at one time was the poet laureate for the state of Alabama. And she runs her own press, which is Negative Capability Press. We met, we discussed the manuscript that I had. She said she would very much like to take a look at it, and things just progressed from there.
Outstanding. One of the poems that are in this is Why I Don't Fish on Sundays. Tell me a little bit about that. Just an interesting title.
Yeah, when I was a very small boy, I grew up in a very traditional Southern family, and so it was a general rule in our house that you don't fish on Sunday, number one. But then number two, the other thing that happened that I recalled from very young childhood was we had a family friend, and she had decided to go fishing on Sunday, which my grandmother and my grandfather, of course, frowned upon and thought, oh, there couldn't be anything worse. But she had gone fishing, and when she was there, she had one of those tall glass bottles of Fanta Orange. And what happened was a yellow jacket came along and lit on the mouth of the bottle, and she's sitting there fishing. She picks up her Fanta bottle and goes to take a sip, and of course the yellow jacket is still there, and it stung her inside the mouth several times. I took some creative liberties with that story and turned it into a narrative poem. And that's how that poem came to be. It was more of a reflection or more of a recollection of that incident from childhood, because I thought how terrible you could be out fishing on Sunday and get stung by yellow jackets, or some other cosmic punishment.
Yes.
But yeah, that was sort of how that came about. Why I won't fish on Sunday. Commandment number 4 from Granddad. Remember big Roberta Mae Fletcher and her tall orange knee-high. She'd skipped service that day and gone down to the bank of Peace River, cold drink relaxing beside her. As she sullied her hook with a solemn cricket, a fat yellow jacket lit on her bottle's mouth. Casting her quiet bait, she went for refreshment and caught hell instead, fiery stings in her throat. They found her swollen shut on Monday, no prayer, no hope for revival, save one black bass struggling at the end of her line, detached, released to live.
Well, I'm going to mention one other title in your book, and one other poem that I caught really quickly, Grading Laundry. I think that all of our female viewers will want to know about what this poem is.
Laundry grading came about as a result of one of my everyday routines, honestly. We live in an era that is wrinkle resistant and iron free, and yet most of the time I still opt to iron, honestly. And because it was a daily thing, my 2 young sons were getting ready for school, and they were watching me do this every day, and they wanted to know, well, why are you doing that? I don't see anybody else ironing. And so we had to talk about that one day, and I wrote that poem from the perspective of my oldest son, who was inquisitive about, well, why do we do this? And as a result, what occurred was sort of this parallel. It was almost a already existing relationship between ironing and then the grading of papers as a teacher. when you read the poem, one of the things that you notice is there's sort of this interchangeability between, say, ironing a shirt and looking over student writing. And that's really what drives the poem, is that relationship, that analogy. Laundry grading. My English teacher father loved ironing, morning ritual, shirt inspection, assessment made with a head shake and frown before laying out the Oxford cloth like some horribly wrong test essay ready for a starch and steam sentence. Punishment for grievously flaw-laden garments in serious need of proofing and editing. Hot flat black triangle, corrector of errors, severe and swifter than any red felt tip pen. In minutes, he'd be creased, seamed, and pressed into perfect MLA format. Pants panels punctuated by pleats and half-inch college-ruled margins outlining his arms in starkest, sharpest, cleanest blank space, created with heat and deliberate precision. His pendulum necktie marked seconds passing over a gleaming brass belt buckle, seemingly saying with each silk swish, "Time's up, pencils down, pass your work to the front."
Well, you know, in looking at just reading through some of the poems of your book, it excites me that poetry is still so alive in this time of technology where we seemingly can put anything on a blog, we can seemingly put anything out in the world on the internet, but there is nothing quite like opening a book and with that, you know, that texture of that paper and reading that poem. It's almost a relationship that you have with poetry.
It absolutely is. The thing that makes poetry so relevant to our modern day circumstances is poetry accomplishes something that no other genre can. You can pick up a work of fiction. Right now I'm reading Harper Lee's latest, Go Set a Watchman, and it is wonderful. There's been a lot of controversy around it and that sort of thing. But fiction and nonfiction and all of the other genres that exist have their own motives. And the motive of poetry, yes, is to communicate, as all other writing does, but it's also to reach inside the reader and make them feel something and make them connect to something that perhaps they didn't think about or they didn't feel prior to the experience of coming into contact with that form of written word.
One of the things that I personally most love about poetry is that it is almost like reading scripture. Sometimes you just can't get it in the first read.
Exactly.
You have to sit down with it, maybe a cup of coffee, a glass of wine, whatever, and read it again and again and again. And it's almost that each sentence within the poem connects to something cognitively, something that's just going to make you think deeper at a deeper level. And you know, it almost becomes spiritual at some point.
It does. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Poetry, of course, you mentioned scripture. There is poetry within scripture that we know of. Poetry as an art form today takes its cues from a number of different traditions, including scripture. But really, whenever you sit down with a poem, you're not reading it in the same way, as I'm sure you know, as you're reading prose. You have to look at each word almost individually and think about all of the possible connotations and all of the possible meanings, as well as how the writer, how the poet is using this word. What is the image that is meant to be generated? What is the idea that is connected to that particular word? And a lot of people, frankly, don't like that. They don't want to have to think that deeply, if you will. But for those of us who enjoy it and for those of us who really love the language and want to savor it, poetry has always been the genre that spoke the most to me personally, and then also that allowed me to communicate in a way that I would not ordinarily be able to.
As the writer of poetry, what is the experience that you have as an individual as you are trying to craft something that makes your reader think at just the deepest possible level? Because I think it would be very easy, you know, and I certainly, you know, I read your poetry and I go, this is really fabulous. I don't think that mine is quite as deep as what I see in some of yours, and I do have to think when I'm reading your stuff a little bit. What are you thinking, though, when it could be an easy write if you wrote it any other way? You could write it any other way and the same message would get there. How do you, as a writer, take that simple message and take it 3 steps deeper?
One of the things that we often have to think about when we're doing any kind of writing, but especially poetry, is what is the best choice at the best time for the best outcome. And it all boils down to a matter of diction. It boils down to a matter of word choice. One of the things that you mentioned, how to decide on poetry as opposed to, say, another form for a message, if the message is going to be conveyed the same, kind of no matter what. If the message can be conveyed in a genre other than poetry, then certainly that might be something I would look at. I have had fiction published in addition to poetry. It is not my first love. It's not my first calling, if you will. But a lot of times there are messages that are meant to be conveyed through prose rather than poetry. And of course, prose poetry is a genre that's out there, and it's very popular. But by that same token, not everything is necessarily meant to be put into a poetic form. You're very right in that. I can't tell you how many times I have wanted to write a poem about one specific issue or another, and when I sat down and I put pen to page, I thought, this is all very well and good, but poetry is not the medium that it needs to be in. This needs to be something else entirely, you know.
Well, writing as an art form, there's many mediums, many genres, you know, and, you know, just because there's so many fabulous poems in here. Once upon, or I think it was actually Upon My Son's Nap Time.
Oh, yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that poem and how that came to be.
When my oldest son was very, very young, when he was an infant to toddler age, I was responsible for sometimes putting him down for naps. And the ritual that we had was I would stand and kind of rock back and forth with him for a little bit, and then I would go and I would put him in his bed. And he would not go to sleep if I just set him down and left him there. He would have to be holding my finger. And whenever, of course, he let go of my finger, I knew he was out, and then I could leave, and that was that. But it's interesting because my oldest son is named after my great uncle who served in the 82nd Airborne. He was involved in the raid on Normandy, the D-Day invasion. He at one time had, I believe, a $10,000 bounty on his head in Italy because he was this special ops ranger type guy who was just phenomenal at what he did for our country. And he is my oldest son's namesake. What I found interesting about that was my oldest son has always been very sensitive, very kind-hearted, very compassionate. And so there was this great contrast between his namesake and then the person that he is and was becoming at the time the poem was written. And that contrast was really what inspired that piece, along with the ritual of, you know, your ordinary parenthood, nap time kind of things. Because I thought, you know, here was this guy who made his livelihood through war, if you will, and yet here is this child that is an embodiment or a representation of the idea of peace. And the two of those came together in an analogous sort of relationship. Upon my son's nap time, I contemplate my greatest uncle, whose speed-bumped knuckles dug trenches in Nazi landscape, foreheads, and faces throughout the era of World War II. An 82nd Airborne Ranger holding a knife was one of the tricks he used to stay alert while standing guard. Its metal clang, if dropped, would keep him awake. Bearing his name, you fight against sleep, clutching my finger like government-issued security. Your digits and palm grasp hard that first joint, not quite the hilt of my hand. I know you've arrived at your dreams when, with a sigh, you allow the release of my unscarred peacetime appendage, exchanging it for your own closed fist.
John, we've talked about so much about craft, about education, working with students, you know, what that process looks like and what that process feels like. You have a huge history of writing, and you kind of are at a place at this moment in career where maybe you're at the culmination of those things to today. Tell us a little bit about kind of where you started in writing and how you got to where you are right this moment.
That's very interesting. When I was in junior high and high school, I was a very florid writer. I used an awful lot of adjectives, an awful lot of adverbs, because I loved the language. I really wanted to suck the marrow out of every single word that I used. And while that was a good inclination at that age, when I went into college and I began majoring in journalism, one of the big tenets of journalism is be concise. And it taught me very quickly that adjectives and adverbs, while they sound nice and they're pretty and that kind of thing, they really don't have a place in informative writing in journalism. So through the experience in journalism, I was allowed to have a number of different angles, a number of different lifetime experiences that then sometimes turned into poems. This is actually my third book. The first one that I published had a number of pieces in it based upon journalistic experiences I'd had. I had been to murder scenes, I had been to house fires and floods and all of these, disastrous, earth-shaking kind of things. And so those sometimes turned into poems, but really the thing that journalism did for my writing more than anything else was it made it cleaner. It made it more concise, rather than having all of this very verbose extra baggage, if you will. It made me think about what is the most efficient use as well as what is the most artful use.
Wonderful. If we have viewers that have a desire just to learn more, where are those viewers going today to get that information, to learn the craft? I know we have some small programs around the county that kind of teach, at night to be a creative writer, that kind of thing.
Sure.
Do you know of any of those programs that you could recommend for our viewers to get involved in creative writing?
Honestly, the first one that comes to mind is there at University of Tampa. Even though it's a graduate level program and certainly there are stringent requirements that need to be met to gain admittance, it really has the potential to transform people as writers. Whenever I first entered that program, I was a very passionate poet, but I didn't know a lot of the unwritten rules of the literary community. And a lot of times, good writing programs like the one at University of Tampa teach you those unwritten rules so that then, even though you're maintaining your voice and your identity as a writer, you have in the back of your mind these different ideas that perhaps editors will have or publishers will have, and it allows you to refine your writing in that way.
John, thank you for being with us today on the Writer's Den.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been an honor.
For more information on poet John Davis Jr., you can go directly to his website, poetjohndavisjr.com. You're going to find out great information, not only about this new book, The Middle Class American Proverb, but you're also going to find out about his other publications and what's going on in his writing, including the things that are upcoming. Thank you so much for joining us on the Writer's Den. We'll see you again next time.